This video is part 1 of 2 for 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John in the Rapture series. Part 1 deals with the authorship, and it's quite long, so it's getting its own standalone video for the series. Part 2 will deal with all of the end times language that is found in the 3 epistles. So let's get into it. So far in the rapture study, we've shown that the rapture concept is biblically sound. The fight is over when will it occur, but the word itself is just the Latin word that Jerome used when translating the Greek New Testament into Latin. That's it. We've shown and covered all of Paul's epistles, and that all of them, other than Philemon, to be containing the Lord's return, and in a twinkling of an eye, living believers will meet the dead in Christ in the clouds to meet Jesus on his descent from heaven and be changed into their eternal heavenly bodies. This event was determined in the 2nd Thessalonians video to occur at the end of the Great Tribulation period, thus a post-trib view where the present evil age comes to an end and the age to come is ushered in. Now, stating that explicitly has the comment section now blowing up with debate. This was anticipated, and as said, we're not done with this topic and will continue to discuss the rest of the New Testament books in relation to it. For the other future timing views, is that they all have a two-phase return of Jesus, meaning that they see the rapture and the second coming as two separate, distinct events. I don't agree with this, as not once in Paul's letters, when describing the Lord's return, did he ever describe it occurring in two phases. And neither did James or Jude. This still begs the question, though, are there any New Testament books that describes a two-phase return of Christ? To find out that answer is that we are going to now unpack all 3 of John's epistles in the next 2 videos. Of the 3 letters, the first is by far the largest, while 2nd and 3rd John are the 2 shortest books in the whole Bible. 1st John is 5 chapters hitting believers hard on the topic of fellowship. The highlight below on this letter being written in Ephesus and around 90 AD are important to the authorship discussion. 2nd and 3rd letters are stamped with the same as well here. What's interesting on the authorship side is that Paul does identify himself in all 13 epistles, while in the general epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and Hebrews don't come with that self-identifier. In the 5 works attributed to John is that only Revelation has the self-identification in the opening and closing chapters. Not even the Gospel includes this. The closest self-identification we get is 2nd and 3rd John opening that says, the elder, as the author of each letter. The Greek word for elder is presbyteros, which doesn't do a whole lot with tagging it to the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee. As such, there are basically 3 views on who wrote the letters. The traditional, the apostle himself. The alternative, the elder, being a different John from the apostle who cannot be tagged to any other John in the New Testament. And the critical view, a group of believers that were part of the Apostle John's community of believers. The critical view has really no basis in recorded history and is simply the same attempt by atheists and liberals, critical scholars in those viewpoints, to avoid early authorship. They do this the same way that they were trying to do that with Paul's letters, but we'll see why here that the traditional view wins the day. For the alternative view, at least it does have a historical point to offer in support of it, and with a different John potentially out there that just no one else knows about. This support comes from Eusebius of Caesarea in his church history book towards the very end of book 3. In chapter 39 of book 3, he mentioned the writings of Papias. These books are not available to us today, though. We just get fragments of his from Irenaeus of Lyons and Eusebius. The piece here is that Papias is described by Irenaeus as an eyewitness / disciple of the Apostle John himself and companion of Polycarp of Smyrna. Eusebius quotes Papias saying, "If then anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I questioned him in regard to the words of the elders, what Andrew or what Peter said, or what was said by Philip, or by Thomas, or by James, or by John, or by Matthew, or by any other of the disciples of the Lord, and what things Aristarchus and the presbyter John, the disciple of the Lord, say. For I did not think that what was to be gotten from the books would profit me as much as what came from the living and abiding voice." Now, here is Eusebius's interpretation of this statement from Papias. It is worthwhile observing here that the name John is twice enumerated by him. The first one he mentions in connection with Peter and James and Matthew and the rest of the apostles, clearly meaning the evangelists. But the other John he mentions after an interval and places him among others outside of the number of the apostles, putting Aristarchus before him, and he distinctly calls him a presbyter. This shows that the statement of those is true who say that there were two persons in Asia that bore the same name, and that there were two tombs in Ephesus, each of which, even to the present day, is called John's. It is important to notice this, for it is probable that it was the second, if one is not willing to admit that it was the first that saw the revelation, which is ascribed by the name to John. So, going back, you can see that Papias does appear to be making a distinction from the first John listed that is grouped with the other apostles, while the second John listed gets a unique descriptor in front and coming after an unknown Aristarchus. Distinction seems to be clearly implied here. Before continuing on this track here, I'm going to quickly go back to the earlier statement of Irenaeus on Papias and Polycarp in relation to the Apostle John. What this statement and many others show is a first and second generation connection to the Apostle John, with Irenaeus being a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. Ignatius of Antioch could possibly be a disciple of John's, but nothing from his works explicitly state this. But as you can see from his extant letters, is that 3 of them match with the 7 churches of Revelation. And Ignatius has a letter directly interacting with Polycarp, which does get referred to in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. In 9:1, you see Ignatius mentioned along with a reference to the recency of Paul and the other apostles. In 13:1 through 2, Polycarp names Ignatius 3 more times along with the letters that were sent by him. So we have an interaction here between Polycarp and Ignatius, and Irenaeus said that there was between Polycarp and Papias as well, which then ties them all directly to the Apostle John. Eusebius, in his church history work, cites Irenaeus and his intercourse with Polycarp and says, "For while I was still a boy, I knew you, Florinus, in Lower Asia in Polycarp's house. How he, Polycarp, reported his intercourse with John and with the others who had seen the Lord, how he remembered their words, and what were the things concerning the Lord which he had heard from them, and about their miracles, and about their teaching, and how Polycarp had received from them the eyewitnesses of the word of life, and reported all things in agreement with the Scriptures." This ties Irenaeus to Polycarp. This makes a lot of sense, as these guys have their locations in Asia Minor, with Irenaeus originally being from Smyrna, where he said he met Polycarp in his youth. The references tying these guys together is quite conclusive. We're now going to discuss the Apostle John's dating, which is tied to the authorship dates of the 5 works, along with from where they were written. Irenaeus, in Book 3 of Against Heresies, says John wrote a gospel, i.e. the Gospel of John, during his residence at Ephesus. 2 chapters later, Irenaeus brings up Polycarp and how he was instructed by apostles, plural, who were the eyewitnesses of Jesus. The location of Polycarp is Smyrna and describes the apostles being in Asia. Within the same section, Irenaeus says the church of Ephesus was founded by the apostle Paul, then says John remained permanently until the times of Emperor Trajan. Paul's founding lines up with Acts 19, but the main thing here is the comment on until the times of Trajan. This places John's life extending to at minimum 98 AD, with his following of Jesus going all the way back to 27 AD. So, John died an old man, and these statements together has Irenaeus placing John's authorship date of his gospel in the 90s AD. Eusebius, in his church history, brings up Irenaeus's Against Heresies work and calls Revelation the Apocalypse of John, and then begins to quote Irenaeus. This quote comes from Book 5 and says that John's apocalyptic vision occurred at the end of Domitian's reign. This dates the book of Revelation to roughly 95 AD, according to Irenaeus. 7 paragraphs later, Eusebius says the following in regards to John's life. But after Domitian had reigned 15 years, and Nerva had succeeded to the empire, the Roman Senate, according to the writers that record the history of those days, voted that Domitian's honors should be canceled, and that those who had been unjustly banished should return to their homes and have their property restored to them. Suetonius, in his 12 Caesars work, does describe the senators wanting to erase him from history. I guess basically the whole darn nation really didn't like Domitian. About a century later, Cassiodeo wrote his famous Roman history work covering 1400 years in 80 books. In book 68, Dio says the same things occurred to Domitian's images and decrees, with new Emperor Nerva releasing all who were on trial for treason and restored the exiles. This is exactly what occurred to John being exiled on Patmos. Eusebius follows this up in paragraph 11, saying, "It was at this time that the Apostle John returned from his banishment in the island and took up his abode at Ephesus, according to ancient Christian tradition." Putting this all together is that Irenaeus is saying that the book of Revelation was written before the gospel was by John. And as said before, this has John's life lasting to at minimum 98 AD, with his following of Jesus going back to 27 AD. That's 71 years. Then adding on the idea that John was probably at least 20 when called, that he's in his 90s now at least, if not 100 at his death. This made me think of the ending of John's gospel, where Jesus told Peter, "What's it with you if John stays alive till he comes again?" It seemed odd to me that that was included in the gospel, because, like, what's the point of it, other than, showing the tension between Peter and John for, whatever purpose. But if John wrote this nearing 100 years old, then it provides some context into that. Clement of Alexandria wrote a similar recap that John returned to Ephesus from Patmos upon the tyrant's death. The emperor isn't mentioned here, but details match Irenaeus and Eusebius that Domitian is suggested to be in mind. Jerome, in his On Illustrious Men work, dates the exiling of John by Domitian to 95 AD, with the composition of Revelation taking place there. Jerome also says that Domitian's cruel acts were annulled by the Senate. The extra chronological piece that Jerome adds is that he is explicit in dating John's death to the beginning of Trajan's reign, saying that he was quite old and died in the 68th year after the crucifixion. This places the death to 98 AD and the crucifixion to 30 AD, according to Jerome. The early church is in agreement with John's death taking place toward the end of the very first century at Ephesus, with his exile being under Domitian, putting the authorship of Revelation at that time. The earliest author we have saying it was during Nero, prior to 70 AD, is Epiphanius of Salamis in the 4th century. Why did he go against what everyone else said? Who knows? But the case is extensively strong that Revelation and the Gospel of John were written by the Apostle John at the end of the 1st century. Now, what about the epistles? 1 John goes back to Papias, who is cited by Eusebius referring to the first epistle of John. This is referring to the Apostle John and not the second John that was always described as the presbyter throughout these fragments. So, it's explicit that the Apostle John was seen as the author of 1 John. The earliest citation I could find comes from Polycarp in chapter 7, verse 1, where it's nearly identical in language to 1 John 4:3. This type of language is only found in John's letters, so you can't just go off and say, oh, he was kind of gleaning from the other books and put it all together. So, having both direct disciples referring to the first epistle shows clear evidence of the Apostle John's authorship to the first epistle. Now, we could also spend a lot of time showing the similarities in theme, style, and language between 1 John and the Gospel, but that's a point that has been conceded by all camps that they are the work of the same hand. The simple and interesting one that I personally like to show at times is the reference to Jesus as the Logos, as this only belongs to John in these 3 places in the New Testament. Now, looking for early 2nd and 3rd John references is a little more difficult. As said earlier, that 2nd and 3rd John are the 2 shortest books in the Bible, and finding verses in reference to them is more difficult with the lack of theological points that is made within those works, while 1 John is just loaded with them throughout the whole epistle. And the question as to why did 2nd and 3rd letters say the elder, I think, has some good context when we take the dates and description of Irenaeus and on John's chronology into account. If the letters were written before the exile, it makes sense as to why John isn't disclosing himself. Persecution is ramping up, and writing in a concealed manner was a security measure. Historically, we will start with Jerome, who we saw earlier date Revelation to 95 AD, and before this he spoke on the epistles saying that John wrote the first epistle, then in reference to 2nd and 3rd John, that they are said to be by others to be the work of John the Elder. And then he repeats the discussion about why there are 2 memorials to John in Ephesus if there weren't 2 Johns, but some had the opinion that both of the sepulchres were for the Apostle John. A few decades before this, we have Eusebius, again in church history, referencing Papias's work, referring to the epistle of the Apostle John, as his first, meaning there are more than just one epistle of his. He's indirectly saying that there's at least a second and really a third that belong to the Apostle John as well. If that is truly the case, then you have a first generation disciple of the Apostle John's giving him authorship credit. 15 chapters before this, Eusebius spoke on all the letters, saying, "But of the writings of John, not only his gospel, but also the former, first, of his epistles have been accepted without dispute both now and in ancient times. But the other two, second and third, are disputed." Eusebius is reflecting on what has been the case, that second and third John are disputed, but that he still holds the view that they are of the Apostle John's, but still leaves the door open to the potential that they just might not be his. Getting more into the weeds is that Eusebius, in his Proof of the Gospel work, describes John never referring to himself explicitly in his letters or gospel, which we talked about earlier. Back to church history, though, is that he brings up Origen, who is from the mid-3rd century, in his view on John's authorship. And in Book 6, Origen gives him credit for the gospel and revelation. And then in the next section, Origen is quoted saying the following on the epistles. "He has left also an epistle of very few lines, perhaps also a second and third, but not all consider them genuine, and together they do not contain 100 lines." It's interesting that Origen calls the first epistle short and then says the second and third are in question within the church as a whole. Another contemporary of Origen is Cyprian of Carthage. In one of his letters, he quotes Aurelius of Celebi, explicitly referring to the Apostle John writing his epistle. Now, note here is that the word epistle is in the singular, but then goes on quoting John. The catch here, though, is that this is clearly coming from 2 John verses 10 and 11. Another mid-3rd century contemporary is Dionysius of Alexandria, who addresses the book of Revelation and how some rejected that work at this time, and then goes on to say that he too struggled with the certainty of the Apostle John being Revelation's author, while certain that John was the author for the gospel in the first epistle. Then refers to second and third epistles as belonging to the apostles. So the short version of this all is that it's just a mixed bag at this point in the mid-3rd century with Revelation and even 2nd and 3rd John. But most of the time, all of these guys at the end of the day are still giving the apostle the credit as being the author of all 5 works. The earliest church writer we have implicitly referring to the 2nd and 3rd epistle is Clement of Alexandria in Stromata Book 2, calling 1 John as the larger epistle while citing 1 John 5:16 through 17. This is implicitly saying 2nd and 3rd John are the apostles according to Clement. Eusebius in Book 6 of Church History says that Clement wrote an abridged commentary on all New Testament books, including the disputed ones that we saw do include 2nd and 3rd John. The canon dispute can be seen going on in the 2nd century in the famous Muratorian fragment or canon list. James, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter weren't part of the list here. Yet you have the Apocalypse of Peter, that's a different work, and Wisdom of Solomon making the list. Earlier Christian Writings website has 6 translations posted for this fragment. The 85 lines are in Latin and aren't the easiest to translate, which is why they'll say and really get into a debate on what a certain line says that deals with John's epistles. The opening lines are fragmented, and so translators like Theron will at times fill in the gaps with his attempt at what the original wording was here. Regardless of all that, is that Luke and John are referred to as the third and fourth Gospels, which presumes that he, at the top, was likely talking about Matthew being present among them, and a note on Mark here is missing altogether. At this point in the fragment, you can see we're at clause 10 here with Theron's translation. It's 10 lines later where the document picks up describing which books are in and saying John and his epistles. The plural here is key, and also that they're distinguished from the gospel account, which is followed by the document's author quoting the first 4 verses from 1 John. Clauses 32 and 43 both clearly give the Apostle John as the author of Revelation as well. So, without question, the Gospel, 1 John, and Revelation are identified as the works of the Apostle John in the fragment, which brings back up the plural use of his epistles. You cannot argue that the document's author used the plural, potentially referring to the Gospel or Revelation. They were clearly set apart with their own statements. So, when he talks of multiple epistles, he is thinking of at least 2, if not 3, giving all 3 letters as we know them today as 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John to the apostle. That's the logical deduction from this. This takes us to the contested clause of number 41. The main debate here is about how to handle the word superscriptio, which you probably are hearing superscript in your head. Theron says, and the 2 with the superscription of John. Frank Daniels and Kenneth Johnson say entitled or bearing the name of John. Bruce Metzger and others will show 2 possibilities to them saying 2 of the above mentioned or bearing the name. Now, I believe I'm getting what they're trying to do here. They're simply trying to put the authorship of 2nd and 3rd John into more question. But I'm sorry, I'm just going to say they're injecting doubtfulness when it's not warranted. When the original author explicitly gave the Apostle John credit to a given work each time he referenced a work. This is the same for the other books cited in the fragment as well. And what's sandwiched in between them? Line 41. So here's a simple way to just look at this whole thing on a holistic basis. We explicitly have John, 1 John, and Revelation given to the apostle. So when the author is referencing to with the superscription of John, is that he is referencing and referring to 2nd and 3rd John. Because what the author is referring to is the superscription identifier that the early church used to describe whose work it was. Papyrus manuscripts that have been found, namely here we're going to look at is P66 dating to 200 AD and P75 dating to the same 200 AD range, contain a superscription for John with his gospel. Dan Wallace's site, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, is just awesome. Wikipedia, I'll give it credit, it's done very well too. On his site though, P66 folio 1, you can see the top here with a superscription for the Gospel of John. This is the case for P75 too. The bonus on 75 is that it comes immediately after the Gospel of Luke closing out that includes a colophon before the Gospel of John begins. Now, just to be fair with all this, is that there are no early extant manuscripts that have this for 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. But that's the same thing for Hebrews and 1st and 2nd Peter as well. So, Theron's translation, which sticks to a more literal translation, I believe is correct, as the Latin superscriptio is literally referring to this for 2nd and 3rd John to be identified with the elder of the author of the letters. This approach keeps us being consistent with the fragment's description of the book being done by the Apostle John with superscription reference sandwiched perfectly in the order in which they appear in the current canon list. Now, one final nugget to bring up with the fragment is that in clause 32, is that it's interesting that it called John the Apostle as the predecessor to the Apostle Paul in writing to the 7 churches of Revelation, being done before Paul wrote his letters to his 7 churches. What that means is that the author was dating Revelation before 70 AD and would have to be seen it done then like in the 50s AD. So this does show a view of pre-70 authorship of Revelation, but claiming that it all came before Paul's epistles is very tough to give it any amount of weight. And really, any evidential support to this just completely bottoms out as well. Regardless, is that it does, say, hey, this was done before 70 AD, and that's, kind of shows that preterist view. Regardless, is that the author spoke on Jesus' return and said that it's still to come, meaning that the author took a futurist view of Jesus' return even when he believed John wrote Revelation before the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem. This flies in the face of full preterism and shows that a pre-70 AD view doesn't necessitate a preterist view of Revelation. However, we have seen clearly that John's earliest followers took a post-70 AD authorship view, which does 100% eliminate the preterist view because they did not see any of those main second coming components being fulfilled. Now, at this time, though, one must also take note that there is no indication within this fragment of any description of a two-phase return view either. So, once Jesus descends, it's for good, according to the Muratorian fragment. So, the Muratorian fragment is the earliest manuscript we have describing John as the author of all 3 epistles. So, what are the earliest possible quotes out there of 2nd and 3rd John? That comes from Irenaeus in Book 3 of Against Heresies. You can see here that Irenaeus is almost one for one while quoting 1 John 2:18 through 22. Verses 20 and 21 are simply paraphrased down. His reference to John's epistle is in the singular. Now, does this mean only one from the apostle in Irenaeus' mind? No, as 3 sections later, Irenaeus refers to John's epistle in the singular again. Then quotes about deceivers coming into the world, that they're Antichrist, and don't take heed to them. This is clearly, though, coming from 2 John verses 7 and 8. It's a one-for-one quote. 2 John 7 through 8 thematically parallels 1 John 2:18 through 22. And 1 John 4:1 and 3. But Irenaeus' citation is clearly that of 2 John verses 7 and 8, and not from the first epistle. And back in Book 1, Irenaeus cites 2 John 10 and 11, including an explicit statement that the Apostle John wrote these verses. So, even though Irenaeus refers to John's epistle in the singular, he clearly sees the apostle as the author of the second epistle, which would then loop the third letter in as well, as they are both coming from the elder, and nobody in the early church or throughout the centuries of scholarship have tried to throw in a third distinct John view. One could even make the case that Polycarp's citation of 1 John 4:3 was that of 2 John 1:7, but I would contend that 1 John 4:3 is the more likely of the two. So, in conclusion, we have clearly seen that first and second generation disciples of John giving the Apostle John explicit recognition as the sole author of all 5 Johannine works, which is why the traditional view wins the day on the authorship debate.
Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.